Okay, all right. Thank you everybody for coming out tonight. I'm just going to briefly introduce both of our speakers here and then let them go ahead and start off. Will be about 40 minutes or so of them giving their speeches, and then afterwards we're going to have a discussion period. You can come into discussion. If you just raise your hand, I will put you on what we call stack, and then we'll go based on whose hand was raised first. You can come in with any questions or any comments that you have, and we'll have more of a discussion style, so the panel can come into discussion during. So I'll go ahead and start. Our two speakers tonight are both socialist feminist organizers. The first is Trillian. She's an organizer with the local branch of Socialist Alternative. And the other is Lucy Marin, who has come all the way from Ireland tonight to speak after she was driving back and forth between Madison and Chicago in the last couple of days to speak and talk about the movement that was built to repeal the 8th Amendment and win abortion rights in Ireland. So I'll let you take it away, Trillian.
Should I stand up, or is it not necessary because we don't have?
You're right in center frame.
All right, I'll stay here then. All right, hi everyone. I'm going to talk a bit about the fight for abortion access in the United States. So prior to 1973, abortion was illegal in almost all states in the U.S. with few exceptions. The Roe v. Wade decision that invalidated those laws and ruled that the right to an abortion is constitutionally protected was officially a decision made by the Supreme Court, but that isn't anywhere near the whole story. The Supreme Court opinion legalized abortion by a 7-2 vote. Perhaps unintuitively, 6 of the 7 justices in the majority opinion were Republican appointees, while one of the 2 dissenters against the right to choose was a Democratic appointee. The fact that a theoretically conservative Supreme Court voted to uphold the right to get an abortion in the early 70s speaks not to the character and judgment of those justices, but rather to the strength and organization of the massive and interconnected civil rights, women's rights, and anti-war movements that were the backdrop to the Roe v. Wade decision. Now, 45 years later, we find that the legal right to an abortion has not guaranteed ordinary people the ability to actually access or afford the procedure. From the moment of the ruling, anti-abortion groups have had their sights set on overturning or subverting this victory. In the decades following the decline of the movements that bore road to victory, we have seen a deliberate chipping away at the accessibility of abortion, as anti-abortion groups have partnered with the Republican Party, who benefit from whipping up a significant base of voters around this issue. This chipping away is constituted by a web of state laws that combine to make it a great hardship or even impossible for many people to have the procedure done, even if it is technically still legal. These laws include prohibiting use of state funds to pay for abortions even if one is enrolled in Medicaid, or restricting coverage of abortions in private insurance plans, or making abortion coverage an additional insurance cost. They also include allowing medical providers or institutions to refuse to provide abortions. They include mandating counseling for pregnant people seeking abortions. That includes straight-up lies about the physical and psychological effects of the procedure. They include diverting public funding to so-called crisis pregnancy centers run by right-wing groups that spread lies and misinformation, or mandatory waiting periods that require making multiple visits to a provider, or obscure regulations regarding the measurements of facilities in which abortions are performed, intended to force many clinics to close. And that's not even all of those laws, but just a sampling. These laws are not only insidious in that their numbers are harder to organize around than a simple broad ban on abortion, but in examining them, we can also see that access to abortion is not only an issue of a pregnant person's rights, but an issue of the rights of working class and poor people. These laws erect economic barriers either in the form of increased medical costs or in the form of an increased amount of time that you might have to take off of work, or increased distance that you might have to travel, and often all 3 of these at once. Where they don't directly raise the financial burden of an abortion, they divert public resources towards right-wing groups. These laws are not simply about disagreements about the morality of abortion. They do not at all prevent the ruling class from accessing this service, and they are a form of class warfare in multiple ways. First, they are part of a broader impulse of the ruling class to limit and cut social programs that ordinary people need, particularly if these programs could be funded by taxing the rich. Second, in limiting women's control over their own bodies, they destabilize their lives, making them more likely to be financially desperate and thus easily taken advantage of as workers. And this is especially true for working women of color, who suffer even greater economic oppression due to the systemic racism on which the ruling class depends to keep workers divided. Now, with Brett Kavanaugh's appointment to the Supreme Court, Roe v. Wade faces even greater jeopardy as Trump and the far right set their eye on either a wholesale overturn of the decision or the possibility of giving states greater freedom to even further restrict abortion access for ordinary people. At the same time, a poll last year showed that 2/3 of Americans support Roe v. Wade. The presence of a mood to fight back against sexism is clear in the explosion of Me Too, both as an online phenomenon and also as a banner for workplace actions against sexual harassment, particularly by Google and McDonald's workers. These actions, as well as the wave of teacher strikes that originated in red states, show that working women have the energy to lead a new labor and civil rights movement. Despite this energy, mainstream liberal women's organizations like NOW and NARAL, as well as the Democratic Party, are not leading a meaningful fight back despite having the resources to do so. After the Democratic victories in the midterms last November, they could have built for the women's marches in January around the call to defend and extend reproductive rights, but instead they dropped their endorsement of the marches. They could have mobilized protest against Brett Kavanaugh. They could have connected the fight for women's rights with the rejection of Trump's racist, sexist, anti-working people agenda. They could have rejected the racist border wall, or gone even further and built support for workers affected by the government shutdown. They certainly haven't mobilized for Medicare for All or for a Green New Deal. The Democrats' unwillingness to build the movements necessary to win such demand shows that while they definitely want to defeat Trump and the Republicans electorally, they're afraid of taking any stance that might offend their corporate donors. We cannot count on them to defend abortion or women's rights. We need to banish the narrative that any positive changes we've seen in the past or will see in the future have been simply given to us by politicians, Republican or Democrat. Working people are only as powerful as we are organized. The fact that we can win Roe v. Wade only to see our access to abortion increasingly diminish as time goes on speaks to the nature of capitalism itself, under which all reforms, no matter how great they are, will only be temporary. While we have enormous potential collective power, working people simply cannot indefinitely maintain the massive mobilization and fight back needed to defend our reforms while we are still living under this system. And as soon as our movements dissolve, the ruling class begins to claw back our hard-won victories. The fight we need to win our rights isn't just defensive against the right-wing attacks. We need to go on the offensive and organize for an end to for-profit health care and for a Medicare for All system, including free, legal, and accessible abortion. We can fight to win a federal $15 minimum wage and high-quality social housing, which is the bare minimum necessary for working-class families. Most importantly, to win permanent change, we'll need to transform these struggles for reforms into a massive fight to end capitalism and build a socialist society based on human need and freedom from exploitation. So with that context, I'm really excited to hear from Lucy about the fight to legalize abortion and how that was won in Ireland, and how socialist organizing beat a very well-funded anti-abortion campaign, which, by the way, received funding in part from right-wing groups in the US, so same enemies.
Thank you, Julian.
Hey, nice to see you. I'll just so yeah, as I said, I'm Lucy. I'm from Belfast, which is in Northern Ireland, but I have been a member of the Socialist Party and ROSA, which is like the sister section of Socialist Alternative in Ireland, and I've been a member of that sort of in the wake of the campaign and stuff, so I've kind of had a bit of experience, so I'm going to talk about that for probably about half an hour. I can be quite softly spoken, and I know that because it might be difficult to understand, so if you need me to slow down, just give me a shout. Okay. So, in the wake of the overwhelming yes vote to repeal Ireland's abortion ban, the 8th Amendment, the Irish Prime Minister, Leo Varadkar, said a quiet revolution is taking place. But this was a bold campaign in which young people and young women in particular became activists. They emblazoned themselves with jumpers and badges that said repeal. They made the case at home and won their families and older relatives to supporting the right to choose. Hundreds of young and working class women stood in the streets with myself and other ROSA activists, handing out leaflets and answering people's questions. On the day before the referendum vote, a small group of anti-choice campaigners stood around our stall to try and intimidate us. Another person flipped over one of our tables. That was because they knew at that stage that they were losing. A ROSA activist then seized the megaphone and started chanting, and moments later a crowd had filled the street and had joined in on the chanting. The men who had been trying to intimidate us sort of scampered off with their legs between their tails between their legs. So it's safe to say that Leo Varadkar was wrong. There was absolutely nothing quiet about this revolution. What we saw last May was a total rejection of the Irish establishment. Ireland saw 66.4% of people voting yes in the referendum, voting for 12 weeks on request and voting for choice. Repeal was a grassroots campaign of women and working class people demanding choice and equality, who were at the forefront of the movement from 2012. It was also a spectacular display of solidarity, with the yes vote reaching 80 and 90% in many working class areas, and the exceptional turnout at polling stations, with the number of young women voters increasing by 94% since the last elections, and with over 90% of women under 25 voting yes, and along with that of the LGBTQ+ community, 91% voted yes. However, it is important to understand why this was the outcome and why did Ireland vote so conclusively for choice. The death of Savita Halappavanar in 2012 triggered waves of anger and protests across Ireland. Savita, who needed an abortion for a pregnancy with fetal abnormalities, was told that this is a Catholic country and consequently died miscarrying in a hospital in Galway. This provoked tens of thousands of young people and young women gathering in protest to demand change, to demand that the restrictive abortion laws be abolished in place of legislation that took into account women's health, fetal abnormalities, rape, incest, and importantly, choice. So the Socialist Party, the sister section of Socialist Alternatives, saw this as an opportunity to call for more than just a small change, but an opportunity to call for the repealing of the 8th Amendment. The movement that already existed in response to the death of Savita was given an expression and concrete demand, and that was to repeal the 8th. In response to this political crisis from the anger at Savita's death, the government, fearing the beginning of a movement spiralling out of their control, implemented the Protection of Life During Pregnancy Act, an act that would send women caught having an abortion to prison for 14 years, and an act that was not only inadequate but actually not aligned at all with the changing attitudes and growing mood in Irish society. No matter how much they refused to reflect these shifts in attitudes, Irish society was already changing in a pretty substantial way. We saw this with the marriage equality movement, which counted tens of thousands on the street and won with the 62% majority. The political establishment had already been pushed back by the success of the Jobestown Not Guilty movement, where working class people, including young people and women, rejected austerity and organised for their right to protest. I have a note here that is connected to this, but I've lost my page. It's here. Working class people protested against the Deputy Prime Minister, who was also leader of the Labour Party, responsible for implementing austerity that had devastated working class communities, and anti-charge activists, including members of the Socialist Party, who faced up to life imprisonment. In taking this prosecution, the state was trying to send a clear message to working class people that if you protest, you can end up in jail. And after a year's campaign, we defeated the government and state, which was a very significant victory for the working class. These things had a really clear effect on the consciousness of workers and young people, who could see how their actions provoked change and how that could be done again. In the context of these things, and before the emergence of a global women's movement, the Socialist Party saw an opportunity for a new feminist wave to erupt, not only in Ireland but worldwide. Because of this, it was decided that a new platform be launched called ROSA Socialist Feminist Movement. ROSA stands for Reproductive Rights Against Oppression, Sexism and Austerity. And this was in order to build a left and socialist wing of the feminist movement that would see its basis in class politics, anti-capitalism and socialist change. ROSA released an anti-capitalist and socialist 15-point programme which had a particular focus on repealing abortion rights in order to intervene in the movement with a more radical and a truly class approach as to why we needed repeal and pro-choice legislation. The growing grassroots movement to repeal the AIDS was putting a lot of pressure on the government, and the possibility to obtain a referendum was increasing, especially after our three members of Parliament, Ruth Coppinger, Paul Murphy and Mick Barry, put forward bills which, added to the grassroots movement of young and working class people, forced the government to establish a citizens' assembly. For context, a citizens' assembly is a group of 100 ordinary people, and here are Irish citizens who are randomly picked to discuss proposals, in this case proposals for abortion legislation. The government was hoping that this assembly would come out with proposals for abortion in limited circumstances only, and that they could use this as a representation of the mood in Irish society generally. However, the Citizens' Assembly reflected the change in attitudes that had already been taking place in society in Ireland and came up with a series of pro-choice recommendations, including that there should be abortion request up to 12 weeks and for health reasons up to 22 weeks. These recommendations were to be sent to the Oireachtas, which is the parliamentary committee, and they in turn were going to be sent to a report to the government. The recommendations of the Citizens' Assembly reflected the position that Rosa's faith in the working class to adopt a pro-choice position was correct. The building of a working class movement outside the Dáil through Rosa had already had an impact and meant that as a result of the Citizens' Assembly, we could see that our analysis of the situation was correct and therefore could build a movement on the basis of solidarity with the working class and women. A real game changer in the abortion debate was the action that Rosa took with the abortion pills, which you might have heard about. Rosa basically organised abortion pill trains and buses travelling across Ireland and distributing abortion pills to those in need, not only in order to raise awareness about the safety of abortion pills, but also their availability. However, this act wasn't just about raising awareness, but it was also a very conscious political act. When the citizen support was being represented, one of the judges pointed out that the abortion pills were a key emerging factor. At the Oireachtas committee itself, evidence was presented that outlined the increased usage of the pills across Ireland in the wake of this. Without the militant actions of Rosa, the committee could have proposed limited abortion legislation, less than 12 weeks, and with many restrictions. But with the availability of the abortion pills highlighted by Rosa, such legislation would be completely unworkable and outdated. This therefore meant that abortion up to 12 weeks was already an established fact in Ireland, and at that stage the majority of the Oireachtas committee felt that they could safely back the proposal. This in itself was a huge breakthrough for the movement because it meant that the campaign could be built upon choice and not just fetal abnormality pregnancies. But if the referendum could be won, Ireland would within months be truly pro-choice. It's important as well to acknowledge that the crucial role that our comrades in Dáil played, particularly Ruth Coppinger in both Parliament and the Parliamentary Committee. Ruth Coppinger, Paul Murphy and Mick Barry acted as representatives of the working class and representatives of women. Ruth especially used her position to reflect within the Dáil the demands of the mass movement outside and to keep up the pressure against the government to put forward pro-choice legislation. She sort of played the role of like an intermediate between the people and the political establishment, with thousands of people watching parliamentary debates every day and responding with sort of increasing anger towards the outdated comments and backwards positions of Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil, who are the two main political parties in the Republic. No matter how these parties have tried to portray themselves as the saviours of women, it's crucially important to recognise that none actually came out as officially pro-choice until the referendum. And the reason they even did that was because they were forced to do so. It was clear that they were trailing behind an inevitable wave of change that was already taking place in Irish society. The eventual reflection by the political establishment of what was already happening from below did cast some false illusions in figures like Leo Varadkar, the Taoiseach Prime Minister, and the Health Minister Simon Harris, particularly after the referendum. But however, in Ireland there's recently been scandals around cervical cancer smear tests that resulted in the deaths of several women due to the privatisation of healthcare. This has really widely challenged that sort of consequent faith in the political establishment. I'd also note quickly that in the context of a healthcare system that isn't fully free and where many working class people are denied proper healthcare if they don't have private health insurance, winning free abortion on demand up to 12 weeks is a absolutely momentous thing, and actually really shows how much can be achieved when the working class organise and unite in a movement demanding change. In terms of the official campaign for repeal, it was to take place across the 2 months before the vote being triggered in March. And this meant that we had 2 months to organise people and build a really strong basis for yes. Throughout this time, there were street demonstrations, ROSA and Solidarity, which is the name that the Socialist Party goes under in the Republic of Ireland, canvassed, and we also had different stalls. Students organised in their campuses, sort of putting pressure on student unions to come out to support Repeal and to vote yes. As to be expected, the no campaign went on the offensive, and although the sentiment for Repeal was clearly more dominant than the sentiment for no, they were able to spread some doubt by focusing on the time limits and the fact that abortion was on demand up to 12 weeks. However, on the other hand, because the no campaign was so offensive about spreading lies about the intentions of women and branding them as murderers, it kick-started a response from women and workers who wanted to fight back against the inherently misogynistic rhetoric. ROSA activists were part of the broad official campaign of Together for Yes, but we felt that it was really important to bring our own radical and socialist campaign to the table and to build a struggle with class politics at the heart of the campaign, and that was why we launched Time for Choice, emphasising that it was about more than just repeal, but about the necessity of choice. And part of the reason why we needed choice was because it became clear that 60% of women accessing abortion in Ireland were doing so because they couldn't afford having another child, which also actually means that under the current system of capitalism, poverty controls the type of family women can or can't have. Statistically, crisis pregnancies are a reality affecting working class women more than any other class, and this was evident in how the campaign was actually driven forward with working class women at the forefront who didn't simply want repeal but wanted choice. ROSA in April held a rally in Dublin, which was the Rally for Choice, and the event had over 500 attendees and really stood out from other events in sort of the broadness of topics touched upon, showing that the repeal movement wasn't just about abortion but was about much more than that. This was evident in the range of speakers we had. So we had comrades from Brazil and Spain who spoke about the strong movement of working class women and that they were seeing against sexism and gender-based violence. We had trade union representatives who were there in personal capacities, which was mainly due to the fact that sort of most trade unions refused to support a vote for repeal. There were speakers taking up the issue of rape and victim blaming, which was particularly prevalent in Northern Ireland at the time with the Ulster Rugby rape trial. I don't know if you've heard anything about that, but if you want to ask questions after, I'm not going to get into it now, it's a whole ordeal. We also had Dr. Rebecca Gomberts from Women on Web, who we worked with in the organising the abortion pill at trains and buses, and also had the huge honour of having Gethin Roberts, who you might sort of recognise the name from Pride, but this is one of the activists from Lesbians and Gays Support the Minors, which was obviously a very inspirational movement of working class people in solidarity with the minor struggle in England and Wales against the government in the 1980s. And as I said, having such a broad range of speakers from a number of areas highlighted that our struggles are connected and made it clear how broad the support for repeal was. After the launch of ROSA's Time for Choice campaign, we organised stalls, canvases and produced different leaflets, particularly aimed at taking up the doubts that people had enforced in them by the no side around the legislation and explaining why it was so pivotal that the legislation was pro-choice. We also produced a range of political material from both ROSA and the Socialist Party, North and South, and organised meetings in order to discuss why not only repeal, but the issue of sexism and all forms of oppression under capitalism, why these are sort of perpetuated by that system. We felt that it was necessary to explain why to vote yes, linking the oppression of women to the capitalist system, which differentiated ROSA from the official campaign who just had vote yes on posters as opposed to genuinely tackling and answering the questions that the public had. I'd say that the whole campaign has not only made ROSA and the Socialist Party a stronger force in our society, in the fact that we have recruited some of the most radical working class youth, and especially young women, who agree with our anti-capitalist, socialist and revolutionary ideas, but also the struggle for repeal has had an incredible effect on the consciousness of working class people. We have seen this in a higher level of activism and organisation of the working class, in the housing crisis and the Take Back the City campaign and occupations, the strike of hospitality workers in Deliveroo, and as well most recently the nationwide nurses strike, which saw a rally of 40,000 in Dublin just weeks ago. These things aren't just happening for no reason. The victory of repeal and even recent years of marriage equality and the water charges campaign has really created a basis for a sea change of attitudes in Irish society. and importantly, people are connecting one movement with another. At housing protests, young women wearing repeal jumpers have led anti-system chants and have become active in fighting in other struggles after the repeal victory. This connection bridge between the movement is most evident in nurses' strike, which is being led by the organisers of Midwives for Choice, a group that organised outside of the Nurses and Midwives trade union due to the anti-choice position that was taken by that trade union. And now we see them leading the biggest nurses and midwives industrial dispute ever to take place in Ireland for better pay, better working conditions, but also a better healthcare system that actually provides for the needs of working class people who rely on it more than any other layer of society. And this is the same for young women and workers in precarious sectors who have seen how the victory of repeal was due to a movement of working class people organising and fighting for their rights. The victory has meant that a new layer of workers and young people are getting active and demanding better conditions in their workplaces. While class consciousness, generally I'd say this is a worldwide trend, is still fairly low, the level has indisputably risen. People saw why repeal won and see through the rhetoric of Leo and his quiet revolution statement. It was clear to people that repeal won because the working class moved into action to demand change, and the working class are beginning to see how that is the key to winning, building a movement of struggle. I'd say this increase in consciousness has definitely been an opportunity for our organisation to intervene in and grow from in order that we can give a strong socialist leadership in the fights to come. It's important to note that it didn't just inspire movements in the south, but also in Northern Ireland, which is part of the UK. Currently in Northern Ireland, we don't have abortion rights, the only part of the UK that doesn't. In the wake of the repeal vote, we organised in Northern Ireland the Bus for Choice, where we travelled around Northern Ireland to the courts, DUP and Sinn Féin offices, taking the abortion pills and dressing as handmaids and demanding that we have abortion rights in the north also. This was broadcasted on the news internationally and actually sparked an emergency debate in Westminster about the idea of decriminalisation UK-wide. It's also important to note, however, that in Northern Ireland the difficulty lies in sectarianism, which has historically divided the working class. This is fostered by the two main parties there, Sinn Féin and DUP, meaning that building a genuine cross-community working class movement has been difficult. The unions also as well, because we don't have marriage equality either, which is brilliant, launched a marriage equality demonstration of 20,000 in 2015, and the question of marriage equality in Northern Ireland is still at the forefront of people's minds, along with abortion rights. However, again, this issue is sectarianised, with Sinn Féin posing themselves as progressive and supportive of these issues in word, but never in action. The DUP are more openly backwards, but this doesn't translate to a backwardness among the Protestant community, who in opinion polls are generally just as, if not more progressive than the Catholic working class and the Catholic community as a whole. Both parties, Sinn Féin and the DUP, are pro-capitalist parties who have voted for austerity, cuts to education and welfare, and do not truly represent working class people, but claim to each represent the wants and needs of their specific community, which is why they continuously get voted in, essentially by fostering sectarian division among the working class of Northern Ireland. I'd also note that with regards to abortion rights in Northern Ireland, we've appealed to trade unions like NIPSA, which is the Northern Ireland Public Service Alliance for Civil Servants, and Unite, which is a hospitality workers union, to basically try and organise a demo similar to the marriage equality one of 2015 in demanding abortion rights. ROSA spoke at a NIPSA conference, and consequently they passed a motion almost unanimously to support us and other pro-choice groups. They also have organised with us a walkout for International Women's Day tomorrow in Belfast on issues like abortion rights, equal pay, an end to rape culture and sexual violence, and an end to precarious working and living conditions. NIPSA and other trade unions like Unite are key in Northern Ireland in bridging the sectarian divide between the Catholic and Protestant working class communities, and are key actually in appealing to broad layers of workers to move them into struggle to demand their rights. This points to the enormous potential power that the trade unions have, not only to improve workers' pay and conditions, but to demand radical change throughout society. I'd say also an important thing to note in the context of Ireland, that repeal itself was a huge victory because it was also a total rejection of the Catholic Church and was probably the biggest victory historically against the Church in Ireland. In 1922, Ireland was in a post-revolutionary situation, and in that situation of political turmoil and workers' actions, capitalists were worried that they would lose control and power, and they saw an opportunity to play in the ideological uniformity of the Catholic faith with which they could use to maintain social order. Consequently, the Church was handed a lot of power, and the government implemented a lot of legislation limiting women's participations in public life, placing them in the home to profit from their free labour and raising a stable workforce for capitalism, while male workers were to serve the capitalist economy in their workplaces. There were laws that forbid sex outside of marriage, there was a ban on contraception, and welfare duties like hospitals, schools, mother and baby homes and Magdalene laundries were handed to the church as a tool to not only ideologically indoctrinate people, but to enforce repression of the working class, and particularly poor and working class women. Working class women and children especially, who lay outside the conventional structures of the patriarchal and nuclear family, were sent to mother and baby homes and Magdalene laundries where they were institutionalised. These women and children experienced abuse, both physically and mentally, for years up until 1996, when the last of the Magdalene laundries were closed. These women were separated from their children, they were mistreated, and often had surgeries performed on them without their knowledge or consent. And the children were treated just as horrendously. One example of this that has become a huge part of the anger at the Catholic Church is the treatment of the Tuam babies. This was a mother and baby home that existed near Galway, where according to records, nearly 800 children died due to neglect over the space of 30 years. And actually were 4 times more likely to die than legitimate children. And the majority of actually burial records for these children don't exist, but a few years ago, remains of bones were discovered in an underground septic tank near the site of the mother and baby home, which is obviously just terrible. It is in part this sort of historic treatment by the Catholic Church of women and children that led to such a conclusive yes vote and a rejection of the no side, which still claim, funny enough, to love both, when the reality is they haven't historically loved both and still do not love both. If you want to know more sort of about the Tuam babies or the mother and baby homes and Magdalene laundries generally, there's like a wealth of documentaries that you can watch, which are hard, but they're really, really important in kind of understanding the history of the Catholic Church's influence in Ireland. Change sort of, as we all know, sort of began happening globally in the late 60s and 70s with the emergence of civil rights movements and women's movements worldwide. This did have a huge impact in Ireland, both north and south, and spurred on workers to begin organising to demand their rights. It was also the beginning of the Church's influence slipping from their grasp with contraception legalised in Ireland, and the impact that the legalisation of abortion had in the US, the legalisation of abortion in the US had in Irish society was substantial also. Consequently, after this had happened, the Church, fearing the complete shift that was already beginning to take place in social attitudes, rushed to get a ban on abortion before it was too late. The government campaigned with Catholic lobby groups to insert an amendment in the Constitution that would forbid the legalisation of abortion, and that became the 8th Amendment, which was passed in a referendum in 1983, but which we fortunately and amazingly repealed last May. Evidence of the loosening of the Church's influence was clear in the difference in how the Pope was received in 1979 compared to last summer. So in 1979, Pope John Paul was greeted by a crowd of 2.5 million believers across different cities and towns in the country. When Pope Francis came last year after the victory of Repeal, it was clear that the Catholic Church that had historically had its strongest base amongst the Irish working class had been decisively rejected by those same people when only a few hundred showed up to his Mass. The day he was to perform the Mass, a rally was called in memory of all the survivors and victims of abuse of the Catholic Church, which attracted thousands, which massively outnumbered those who attended the Pope's Mass. This has made it undeniably clear how huge the shift in social attitudes has been, and how there has been a realisation and rejection of the backwards, repressive and antiquated attitudes of the Catholic Church and the Irish government. It's also worth mentioning that both north and south, movements against victim blaming in the courts have grown massively. In the context of what I mentioned before, the Ulster Rugby rape trial and also the Cork rape trial, cases where in both circumstances the victim's clothing were passed around the courts as evidence of consent. The intervention of ROSA and the Socialist Party has been to organise protests against these. In the wake of the Ulster Rugby rape trial, protests called in 2 days' notice attracted thousands. Our interventions were aimed at not only calling out the sexist ideas perpetuated about women and pointing clearly at the justice system as complicit in this, but to also expose the system of capitalism as a system where sexism and misogyny have their benefits to the ruling elite and cannot be overcome while economic inequalities exist. And the idea that women are lesser than men is pushed and used as a basis to establish the economic and social exploitation of women. In Dublin, ROSA organised a march against victim blaming in the courts last April, which attracted a crowd of 8,000, and Ruth Coppinger, RTD, her anti-capitalist and pro-socialist speech heard cheers from the thousands of attendees there. These took place coming up to the repeal vote, which you must recognise as an indication of the changing attitudes of people, and people saw that the fight for abortion rights is linked to the fight for the equality of working class women. I'm going to start wrapping up here because I have been going on for a bit, but if there's any questions and specific references, obviously you can ask me during the discussion. So yeah, I'd say that one of the most important things to take from Repeal was that wasn't just a victory of women, it was also a massive victory against the backwards establishment, against the church, and has raised the expectations of the working class and what they can achieve when they organise. It's created an openness to left-wing ideas where we, as socialists and revolutionaries, can build from to defend the working class and demand a society that is run in the interests of the many and not the few. Following Repeal, there is the demand for the separation of church and state in Ireland, which is possible but only with massive pressure from below and a struggle of the working class similar to the struggle for Repeal. Such a movement could also open avenues to expose the capitalist Irish government, which has been reliant on the church's money for decades in running, as I mentioned, hospitals and schools, with the effect of enforcing the backwards ideas and agenda of the Catholic Church onto the working class of Ireland. This is why building a powerful socialist left that is willing to break with this backwards capitalist system is critical to achieving the real change that we need in achieving better working conditions, better pay, a free and accessible health service and free education. It has been made clear what kind of movement we need in Northern Ireland in order to achieve the same rights and build a movement with the same demands. For International Women's Day this year, ROSA, both North and South, have organised a coalition with other groups, in the North with NIPS and Unite, and in the South with Unite and USI, with a range of demands, including in the North abortion rights, and both North and South, an end to gender-based violence and sexual harassment, including in the workplace, an end to precarious working and living conditions, an end to the gender pay gap for a living wage for all, and also solidarity with the struggles against oppression and the workers' struggle in Ireland and worldwide. We have called in both Northern Ireland and the Republic walkouts and protests, along with an intervention in the marches that will be taking place. So yeah, to conclude quickly, it's really important to recognise that the women's movement is not just exclusive to Ireland, but something we've seen erupting worldwide. In Latin America with Ni Una Menos, in Spain where 6 million working class women and men marched against gender-based violence last International Women's Day, but also in India, here in the US, and so on. It's imperative that we intervene and build from these movements in order to expose the exploitation peddled by capitalism of the masses, showing how capitalism profits from this exploitation socially and economically, and explain why and how we can break with this current system. The beginnings of this we're seeing in Repeal and have been witnessed worldwide in workers' struggle, and it's pivotal that we continue to fight and build in order to create a tidal wave of change that can finally put an end to all forms of oppression and create a socialist society that is run in the interests of the many and not the few. So I'm going to just wrap up there.
Thank you so much, Lucy. Okay, so I'm going